Okay, until now, we talked about how Jewish identity was affected in Europe by the emancipation. I wanted to talk about what I call the fourth reaction to emancipation. Why do I call it the fourth? The first one I said was the Reform movement. The second one is modern Orthodoxy, which is a reaction to the Reform movement. The third one is the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, who was an reaction to emancipation and also the Reform movement. The conservative movement is something which is specifically in the United States. It's not a reaction to the emancipation in Europe. And that's why I don't put it as one of the four. The fourth one I call modern Zionism. Modern Zionism is also a reaction to emancipation, and I will explain. Again, there are aliyot to Israel. Aliyot, we call immigrating to Israel an aliyah, of this idea that Israel is high up, it's mountainous, and therefore the term in Hebrew is aliyah, to go up. So this is the traditional term of when a Jew comes back to Israel. There were aliyot to Israel before modern Zionism. You had individuals in every generation. There was an attempt of aliyah to Israel in 1700 by a group of Jews from Germany under Rabbi Judah the Saintly, Yehuda Chassid. Just a few hundred. But he died within the year, and then it all disbanded. There was another attempt in the 1770s, both by Hasidim and also opponents to Hasidism. This was in around 1770. There was another aliyah of over 500 people in 1808, also from Lithuania, organized by students of the Vilna Gaon. But these are traditional aliyot which are before the emancipation. They're not a reaction to the emancipation. Modern Zionism is a reaction to the emancipation. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I have a few sources here for you. Or in Hebrew, I was able to translate them into English, but I didn't have enough time also to use Google Translate for Romanian. And since at least the English I can correct, the Romanian I cannot, so I left it in the English translation. So, okay, let's see if you can see this. Okay, first of all, what does it mean that modern Zionism is a reaction to emancipation? In the 19th century, there is very strong nationalist sentiment in Europe. This sentiment makes its way felt in many countries. There are also nationalist movements, socialism, which starts at the second half of the 19th century. As we know, after the First World War, many small countries regained their national identity. Shalom, Monica. Put that down.
Shalom. I just entered.
Yes,
I didn't find the link.
Not a problem.
Sorry.
Yeah, you are here somewhere.
And please, Mara and Dana came.
Thank you.
Mara, one moment. Mara Imran.
Yes.
Yes.
I think I knew that.
And Dana Schlanger.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
So with emancipation, you have national sentiment. However, the Jews who went through emancipation in Germany and in France, for them, they were very interested in trying to regain their rights as a minority. So for them, the idea of a national homeland was very far from their type of thinking. That's why we don't find almost any Zionists in Western Europe. Because the countries where emancipation were rooted and became strong movements. And these countries started incorporating minorities and allowing them to have rights, including the Jews, even if there still was anti-Semitism. In those countries, the Jews were very interested on receiving those rights and being part of society. I talked about the assimilation that happened. It's specifically the countries where emancipation did not arrive that there the Jews started wondering about maybe we should have our own country. Specifically, I'm talking about Russia. The first modern Zionist movement happens in Russia in 1864, and it is called Hibat Zion. In Hebrew, that means lovers of Zion. Lovers of Zion. And the members are called Chovavei Zion, lovers of Zion. It's called the Love of Zion movement and the Lovers of Zion. Why specifically does this happen in Russia? Because the Jews in Russia were waiting for the emancipation to happen, and it never did. So because the emancipation never, even Jews who were enlightened, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, which is Jews who wanted to go to universities, who wanted to study secular studies, who wanted to become part of Russian culture, these Jews felt rejected because Russia was not granting them equal rights. So it's not surprising that you have a fellow by the name of Leon Pinsker, who was a Russian-born Jew who was very much in part of what was called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, the movement that wanted to get Jews involved in general literature, in Russian literature, in the sciences, in philosophy. But he wrote a book which was called Auto-Emancipation. And Pinsker's book, Auto-Emancipation, the bottom line of the book was, it looks like we'll never reach emancipation in Russia, so we have to do it for ourselves. That was the point of the book. And how do you do it by yourself? By rebuilding your people in the land of Israel. That's the only way Jews will ever get emancipation, because the Europeans, including the Russians, are not interested in giving it to us. And specifically the Russians. Now, it wasn't just Pinsker. There were other Eastern European countries which were toying around with the idea of Zionism because they were also nervous that emancipation wasn't arriving. One of these countries was Romania. The Jewish communities in Romania, under the when Jan Kuza was the leader of Romania. So Jan Kuza promised the Jews that they would have equal rights, just like in all the other European countries. So the Jews were very excited. However, when he gained power, his government was opposed. There was nothing he could do. And the Jews were very disappointed. And therefore, it's not surprising that the first Zionist conference of the Russian kibbutzing movement, but the members from Romania, takes place in the city of Focșani in Romania in 1871. I think it was 1871. I have to look on Google. So why is this? This is a reaction to not receiving rights, to not being able to get equal rights as promised. Let me just look if I can find the exact year that this happens.
I think it's 1881, but I'm not sure.
I think it's earlier than that.
Yes. 31 December.
1881?
Yes.
A moment.
Yes, it's definitely 1881. So
10 years after.
December, yeah.
Wait, and when is the first kibbutzing? When is the Katowice conference in Katowice? Yeah, it says the Folkshan Congress of 1882. Okay, let me see. So when is the Zionist Conference of Katowice in Poland? Katowice Conference of the Zion movement. This takes place. Oh my, 1884. Okay. Okay, so the conference in Romanian, Focșani, was basically Romanian Zionists who were part of the kibbutzing movement. 2 years later, in 1884, you have the movement's Congress in Katowice in Poland, where you have delegates from various countries, less localized. The kibbutzing movement was only partially successful. It was able to get people interested in the idea of settlement in the land of Israel. It was also a very inclusive Zionist movement in the sense that you had religious and non-religious Jews working side by side. So you had, for instance, when Leon Pinsker was the director general of the kibbutzing movement, and he was more, I would say, sort of a halfway between a secular and a traditionalist Jew. Let me put it that way. He worked together with Rabbi Shmuel Moliver, who at that time was the president of the kibbutzing movement, and they didn't have any problems working together. So that, in that sense, they were successful. They were both traditionalist Jews and secular Jews working hand in hand to try to create auto-emancipation, basically to settlements on the land of Israel. There is one wave of Aliyah that we attribute to the kibbutzing movement, and that is the Aliyah in 1882. The Aliyah in 1882, which is referred to as the first Aliyah to modern Israel, even though there were people living there before. So, I mean, you had Jews living there before. The Jews were the majority of Jerusalem in 1850, what we call the old Yishuv, the old settlements in Israel. There always were Jews in Israel. But the modern Zionism sees its beginning in the first Aliyah of 1881, which was actually an Aliyah of the kibbutzing Russian movement. Just want to point that out. They are the founders of the city Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov. Let's see if anything else. Those are the ones, and Petach Tikva. So, but let's say specifically Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov were members of the kibbutzing movement. And you have a few other cities which are established simultaneously as moshavot, as settlements at this time. Before this Zionist, the Herzlian Zionism, you know, Herzl was only born in 1860. Herzlian Zionism starts with the conference in Basel in Switzerland, 1897. So that's already 15 years later. Herzlian Zionism is a very politically oriented Zionism. In other words, the goal is focused. The idea is to be able to resettle the Jews in Israel. Herzl writes 2 books. One of them is called Alt Neuland, and the other one, The Jewish State. In his first book, he actually doesn't even mention the land of Israel. He just talks about a Jewish state. In his second book, he does. If you remember, in the second, I think it was the second Zion, you know, the first Zionist conference, which, by the way, had some fallout with the Orthodox Jewish community because of Herzl. Herzl, of course, was a secular Jew, very assimilated. He had worked as a journalist in Austria. He was born in Budapest, in Hungary, and his grandfather was a religious Jew, I think even a rabbi, but he was not in any sense. But he was very proud of his heritage. But because that form of Zionism, Herzlian Zionism, the leader was Herzl, there were a lot of rabbis who were part of the kibbutzing Russian movement who decided not to join. because they thought that it was not appropriate. So that the Herzlian Zionist movement is a little more secular than the Russian kibbutzing Zionist movement, which was more traditionalist. However, there are groups, religious groups that do join the Herzlian Congress, specifically a group which will be known as the Mizrahi, which was founded in 1902, but already had delegates at the Basel Conference in 1892. This was a group under the heading of Rabbi Jacob Reines, who believed that it's important for religious Jews to be part of Herzlian Zionism, and they become also the forerunner of what's called the Religious Zionist Party in the Israeli government. So, but I'm not yet at the modern state. I'm getting there. So, look, I want to backtrack for a moment. Before Herzlian Zionism, before the kibbutzing Zionist movement of Russia, Romania, you have an interesting thinker whose name is Moses Hess. Moses Hess is considered first modern Zionist. Again, when I'm talking about modern Zionism, I'm talking about those who saw Zionism as a reaction to emancipation. Because as I said, there were Jews in the land of Israel before Herzl was born. And there were many Jews, thousands of Jews living in the land of Israel before 1897, before the first Congress of Herzlian Zionism. But the ones who lived in the land of Israel didn't have that much political orientation. Those who did, there was not a lot that they could do under the Ottoman Empire. They had their hands tied. They didn't really have monetary means to try to build up towns, etc. But there was a lot of goodwill, let me put it that way. I want to talk about somebody who in 1864 writes a book which is considered the earliest modern Zionist book. I'm referring to Moses Hess. Moses Hess, born in 1812, dies in 1872. He's a very interesting individual. I am going to make this a little bit larger if I can figure out where to do it. Oh, here. He's born in Bonn. At that time, it was French-occupied Germany. He moved to Cologne. Moshe Hess was friendly with Karl Marx and Engels. Okay. At that time, Karl Marx was living in England and already writing about socialism. Both these individuals, Marx and Engels, were the founders of communism. Moshe Hess himself was sympathetic to communism, but deviated from his colleagues and believed that it was the time for Jewish nationalism. He thought the time was ripe because both in Germany and in England, there was a rise of anti-Semitism, and it was obvious that the nations would not really accept the Jews, even if the government would. Hess was educated in a scholarly Jew. He was a thinker, a connoisseur. He grew up in a traditional Jewish home, but migrated away from that. Only after the blood libels in Damascus, if you remember, blood libels were when Jews were blamed for using the blood of Christian children to make their matzahs, their unleavened bread, on Passover. This went on during the Middle Ages for a very long time. One of the last blood libels was the Damascus blood libel. The actual last blood libel in history took place in Moscow in around 1917. It actually went to court. In the end, the Jews were exonerated. They were found not guilty. That was the last one recorded in history. The Damascus blood libel was very severe. That time, by the way, Damascus was a Christian city. After the Damascus blood libel, which was an event that caused him an existential shock, he returned to embrace his Judaism from a philosophic point of view. So, Hess writes in his book, "The spring in the life of nations began with the French Revolution. The year 1789 marks the peak of spring in the lives of peoples of history. Revival of the nations became a natural phenomenon. Even Greece and Rome are also being renewed. Poland is breathing the air of freedom again. Hungary is preparing itself for its last battle for its liberation. Among the peoples who are considered dead, when they will realize again their historical mission, they will start fighting for their historical rights. Among those nations, we find Israel. So Hess is writing in 1864 that it's time for the Jews to go back to their land en masse and realize their own nationalism. This is a year or two before the Russian Zionist movement of Hibat. This is when Theodor Herzl was only 2 years old. So Hess already is thinking about these things and writing about them. The name of the book is Rome and Jerusalem. Rome and Jerusalem. Okay, another quote from his book, Rome and Jerusalem, which he wrote in German, of course. After 20 years of distancing myself, I return to my people. I have returned to be one of them, to participate in the celebration of their holidays, to participate in the nation's memories and hopes, to be a partner in the spiritual and intellectual struggle that takes place within the house of Israel on one hand, and between our people and the progressive nations around us on the other hand. Although the Jews lived among the nations for close to 2,000 years, they can never be an organic part of these nations. So Hess is saying the Jews cannot be part of the nations. They'll never be accepted as equal, and therefore they must recognize their national right. Again, another quote from Rome and Jerusalem. I have to say, by the way, that Karl Marx and Engels were shocked when they saw that their friend Moshe Hess was interested in Jewish nationalism. As I told you, most Western European Jews did not even understand the point. Marx, of course, was very assimilated. The Jews cannot assimilate among the peoples, writes Hess, in which they live without denying their national religion and their traditions. In other words, if Jews want to be Frenchmen and Germans, they will be asked to deny their religion and their traditions. Those of our brothers who tried to assimilate, and in order to achieve complete emancipation, convinced themselves and other modern Jews to have no national feeling, have lost their heads. In other words, that's ridiculous. There's no reason to lose our national and traditional feelings just to become emancipated. Again, I'm quoting from Rome and Jerusalem. The Jews have always, from the beginning of history, preserved their faith in the Messianic era. This belief is symbolized in our historic religion, the Sabbath. Observance of the Sabbath embodies the idea that has always expressed us. The future will bring about the realization, the historical Shabbat, just as the past brought us the natural Shabbat. In other words, history, like nature, bring about an age of harmonious perfection. So, Jews believe in the perfection of the world. They also, says Hess, this will start only after they start realizing their national obligation. And the last quote from his book, there's a story about a knight who was going to the Holy Land during the Crusades and returned from the Holy Land with a dried flower from Israel to bring to his friend who was a rabbi. The rabbi took the rose from his friend and watered it with his tears. Then a miracle happened. The flower began to bloom again and show the smell of its fragrance. The rabbi said to the knight, "Don't be surprised, my friend, because the people of Israel are like this dry flower. They too will bloom like a rose when they return to the garden of their youth." So Moshe Hess is really the first post-emancipation modern Zionist thinker. And this is the way he's seen here in Israel too. I don't know how many people have read his book, but this is the way he is seen. And he was talking about things that others were not certain that it was possible. Yes, there was a yeshuv in the land of Israel. There were Jews living in Jerusalem, Jews living in Tiberias, in Safed at the time. But it wasn't in Hebron and other places. But it wasn't clear if there was even a possibility of Jewish nationalism as a country. Remember, under the Ottoman Empire, there were many, many provinces. And definitely there was no reason for the Ottomans to grant the Jews a country and independence. So this was not a clear possibility. And that's probably why the kibbutzing movement, even though they're also after. But Hess is the first to talk about this openly. First of the moderns to talk about it openly. Okay. Now, herzlian Zionism is an idea. It's an idea of moving the Jews back to their land. In the Congress of Basel in 1897, the platform established for the reason why it's necessary to move the Jews back to their land was because of anti-Semitism. The Basel Conference says the only way we can solve anti-Semitism is by bringing the Jews to their land. In fact, in 1904, there was a pogrom in Kishinev. And in the wake of this pogrom, they made another Zionist conference to discuss what do we do in order to save the Jews, because we can't even wait to get the land of Israel. We need a place to put them. There are those who spoke to the British, and the British offered the Zionist Congress a piece of land in Uganda. This was called the Uganda Plan. It was actually brought to the Zionist conference, and many people thought, after the massacres that happened in Kishinev, maybe we should do it as a temporary step. I've always said that only Jews who lived in the exile for 2,000 years could somewhat come up with such a crazy idea. We'll have a temporary country in Uganda, and then we'll move it eventually to Israel, as if you can move a country from one continent to another. But so the resolution was voted on. It actually got a majority at the Zionist conference because of Kishinev massacre. But then a fist fight broke out, and there was literally shouting and things that were going on. Finally, they decided, okay, they decided not to decide. That's what happened. So even though the Uganda plan officially was voted on, it never was materialized, which is very good because it would have never happened. No Jew would have gone to Uganda. And even if so, it would have been like the fate of Azerbaijan in communist Russia. Right? They put Jews in Azerbaijan, nothing happened. Or Baron de Hirsch, who bought land in Argentina to settle Jews. Also didn't work. So some Jews became gauchos, cowboys, and went there, but not very many. Because there needs to be a historical and a national connection for people to go. Has to be a reason. Now, the early Zionist movements that came after Herzl, what we call the chalutzim, the pioneers. Remember, they're the pioneers of Herzlian Zionism and of the kibbutzing movement. The first Aliyah, 1882, are pioneers of the kibbutzing movement, the Russian Zionist movement. Okay, Russian, Romanian. There might have been a few other countries. But the second Aliyah, which is around 1905, these are people already who are making Aliyah after herzlian Zionism has established a political platform. Now, this is a very interesting Aliyah, the Aliyah from 1905. This is what we call the first secular Aliyah to Israel. When we talk about secular Zionism, it starts really with herzlian Zionism, and it comes to fruition somewhere around 1904, 1905, which is the year of the death of Herzl. You know, Herzl in his diary, he writes in 1897, after the Basel Conference, he says, many people did not understand what happened today, but everyone will understand in 50 years' time. It was almost prophetic. 50 years' time, 1947. That's when the UN partition vote took place. Because in 50 years' time, he writes in his diary, everybody will understand. However, when Herzl dies in 1905, he probably died very disappointed because he was really hoping that there would be mass waves of Jews to pick up on the idea, and that did not happen. But what did happen was a very interesting movement of what we call the secular Zionist movement. There's a lot to say about this. I'll try to explain it very briefly. Zionism, as I said, was very popular in Russia. Because it was popular in Russia, why was it popular in Russia? Because it was obvious for Jews, whether religious or secular, that the Russians were not going to accept them as equals. That was obvious. Until the Russian Revolution, Jews were not allowed into the major cities of Russia. They had to live in the areas that were designated for Jews, which we call the Pale of Settlement. Jews were not allowed in Moscow. They were not allowed in St. Petersburg. They could not attend the universities. So it was quite obvious that if you wanted to do something, so what could a Jew in Russia do? They could study Torah and yeshiva in an academy, open up a store. You could do that. But let's say they wanted to do something exciting, because young people like something exciting. Zionism was exciting. It was going out to a faraway land of our history, working in agriculture in a kibbutz, being very far away from your parents, because most of the people were really young. I'm talking about 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, very young people. And it was an experience, it was an adventure, and many of them rebelled against their parents. I have to say something about secular Zionism. We use the term secular Zionism. However, the secular Zionism of the first quarter of the 20th century were not exactly secular Zionisms like you would find secular Zionists in Germany and France who were born to assimilated parents. These were young people who had grown up in religious homes. Some of them grew up in Hasidic homes. They too grew up as religious, but then they rebelled. For whatever reason. Everybody had different reasons. But the secularists among them were people who rebelled against religion and felt that Zionism was the future of the Jewish people. And that the way the Jews in Russia were living in poverty and small villages and small shtetls, this was not going to be the future of the Jewish people. So it was a mixture of the Zionist dream, which was a secular messianic Jewish dream. It was like secular messianism with a Jewish twist to it. But it definitely was a messianic movement. And again, these secularists were very Jewish. It's not like today you take a secular Jew from Los Angeles who knows nothing about Judaism, nothing about Jewish history, and you say to him, do you want to go to Israel? He'll say, no. That's obvious. The secular Zionists wanted to go to Israel because it was part of how they were brought up. They prayed 3 times a day about the return to Jerusalem. So it meant something to them. They rebelled against the tradition. They didn't rebel against being Jewish. So for them, this was a new interpretation that they were able to interpret their Judaism both by rebelling and embracing simultaneously. It's a very unique phenomena. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook wrote a lot about this unique generation that was both rebelling and embracing simultaneously. Only if you understand that dichotomy, that paradox, will you understand some of the paradox in Israeli society today, but this is not the time yet to talk about it because we didn't get there on our historical timeline. When we get to there on our historical timeline, hopefully you'll understand the whole picture, the mosaic of Israeli society. Because remember, the Israeli society is probably the most diverse society, definitely among Jewish communities on this planet, that's not a question, but possibly of most nations on this planet. Because you have Jews who emigrated to Israel, probably from at least 50 countries. I'm not even sure, maybe in Canada you have people from 50 countries, maybe from the United States. But to have such a small country with people from 50 countries immigrating towards it, it's very, very unusual. Even if they're all Jews, they all have different cultural experiences. And if some are religious and some are secular, they definitely have different cultural experiences. Because then there's less of the common denominator. There's a lot to say about that. It's really a miracle that Israel was able to pull it to get itself together as a country. Definitely a miracle. So let's go back again. So I'm talking about now the early idealist secular Zionists, and these are idealists. Why are they idealists? Because they know that in Israel, it's basically a land which cannot promise you milk and honey. There are very few jobs. If you go to redeem land in order to build a settlement or a kibbutz, it's really hard work. And Jews are not used to being agriculturalists. They have no experience in that in Russia. They own no land in Europe that they could have done such. Maybe they could have had a cow in their backyard or a chicken, but nothing more than that. So they knew nothing about agriculture. But this ideal of let's reconnect to the land, build up, remember the kibbutz is a commune. It's based on the communist idea of working together economically for the better good of everybody. I've always said that the kibbutz movement in Israel, established in the first quarter of the 20th century, was the only successful example of communism, of true free communism in the 20th century. Remember, communism is a form of democracy. People forget that because we think of Stalinism. Communism as a concept is a form of democracy. In the kibbutz movement, it was a democratic way of running the kibbutz. You know, if you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or even Benedict Spinoza, when they talk about democracy, for them it's obvious that democracy could only work if you have a very small community, because they understood democracy as constantly having referendums, because you have to ask everybody their opinion. So they thought if you have to ask everybody your opinion, then it only works, let's say, in a city. It can't work in a country, because how can you ask everybody in the country their opinion all the time? Okay, in Switzerland, they do it, by the way, every now and then. But most democracies, the way most democracies work today, for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that's considered an oligarchy. So, or only certain people are representatives. But we work today, all the countries today who are democratic, work by representative democracy. You vote for your representatives, and these guys are your voice in the parliament. But in the early writings of democracy, as I said, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like Spinoza, who was much before him, they didn't understand how it worked. Exactly. as I said, specifically, Spinoza is writing in the 17th century, really didn't understand how it was possible. He didn't think it was a bad idea. He just didn't understand how to do it. You know, when Alex de Tocqueville wrote his book, Democracy in America, in the 18th century, he wrote a whole book about how democracy works in America by spending 2 weeks in the United States. That was it. He was there for 2 weeks. And he wrote a 2-volume book, which is called Democracy in America, which was a very important book. And his analysis is tremendous, how this person in 2 weeks could come up with these ideas about how, because he was wondering, he said, in England, in France, it doesn't seem to be working. So how do these Americans, how do they have it working? And he explains why it works in America. All the ideas, the social ideas, the communal ideas, and how democracy works there. Very, very important work by Alex de Tocqueville. Anyhow, so getting back to this, the kibbutz are these little communes, democratic communes, which are based on agriculture. Everybody works, is assigned to work. And of course, the income to the kibbutz is divided among everybody. There's there's a dining room where everybody eats breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm talking about the early kibbutz movement, right? Everybody ate together, had their festivals together. The early kibbutzim were all secular. Later on, there were religious kibbutzim as well. But the kibbutz movement is mostly a phenomena of the first quarter of the 20th century. When the early kibbutzim were established, one of the most famous ones is Kibbutz Degania, established right next to Tiberias on the Kinneret, one of the earliest kibbutzim. I want to read to you now from the writings of just one person of that era. His name is Aaron David Gordon. Aaron David Gordon became one of the ideologues of the labor movement, which really means of the kibbutz movement. Because the Labor Party was formed out of the ideologues of the labor kibbutz movement. And one of the interesting people, there are many, but one of the interesting people is this Aaron David Gordon. So I'll show it to you right now. I called it Things You Didn't Know About Aaron David Gordon. Of course, if you didn't know anything about him, then that's okay. Who is Aaron David Gordon? He's born in the end of the 19th century. He joins the Russian Hibat movement after the pogroms of 1881. By the way, the first Aliyah in 1882 is also a reaction to pogroms that happened in Russia. He had 7 children, and only 2 of them survived childhood. By the way, this was not unusual before the 20th century. For the 20th century, most children died at a young age because medicine was not very developed. His son left home to study in yeshiva, and his son worked for Baron Ginsburg, who was Baron David Ginsburg, a very rich man in Russia who had lands and employed people. Now, I have to mention one thing about Aleph Dalet Gordon. Like many of the ideologues of the early labor movement, he is from a religious house. As I said, almost without exception, all these early, what we call secular Zionists, came from religious homes. That's why I always say it's sort of secular Zionism, but they have a very strong connection to both Jewish tradition and the Jewish people. So first he joins the kibbutzim movement after the pogroms of 1881. In 1904, after the death of his parents and after raising his 2 children, he refused to get a job from Baron Ginsburg, who had offered him a job, and decided to immigrate to Israel at the age of 48. They would say, the age of 48, that's not too old. But when you understand, work in the kibbutzim and in the settlements was very hard work. most of the people at this point in history who joined secular Zionism in Israel were very young people from the ages of 16 to 25. That was the majority. Aleph, Dalet, and Gordon, they saw him as a father figure because he came to Israel at 48. David Ben Gurion was called the old man by the time he was 40 years old. They referred to him as the old man. I think he died at 72 or something like that. But like half his life, they used to refer to him as the old man. These were very young people because these were the type of people who were coming to Israel during this time. From 1904 till 1925, 1930. Yes, till about 1930. These were idealistic aliyot. These were people who came because they believed in Zionism, wanted to give it a chance. Okay, he comes to Israel at the age of 48. He's offered a job as a teacher. As they say, 48 years old, what are you going to do here? He wanted manual labor in Petach Tikva. He wanted to work the ground or to build a ditch or a house because he believed in that. The salary did not make it possible for him to send money home. So he moved work in Baron Rothschild's vineyard in Rishon LeZion. As it's physical labor, but better pay. In contrast to those who advocated Arabs working, because one of the paradoxes of early Zionism is that they preached the importance of working the land, but because there were so many Jews who were not used to menial labor of that type, a lot of them just employed Arabs to do the work. A lot of the early kibbutzim, it was a fight, really, an ideological fight among the kibbutzim, whether this was right to do or not. Gordon spoke about the sanctification of work. He personally contracted malaria. He was even shot by 3 Arabs on horseback on his way to Jaffa, so he had a lot of difficult experiences. And the conflict between the religious inspectors of the vineyard and his secular workers, Gordon was a mediator. He came out against the inspectors' boycott and even criticized the workers for disrespecting the inspectors. After 3 years, finally, his wife and his daughter Yael immigrated to Israel, and they settled in a small town called Ein Ganim. There they met with another ideologue of the labor movement, whose name was Yosef Chaim Brenner, who was also from a religious home and became secular. And David Shimoni, who was also from a religious home and became a secular Zionist. David Shimoni was also a well-known writer in Hebrew. In fact, right down my street, there's a street called David Shimoni Street. I live in an area of Jerusalem where all the names of the streets are named after Hebrew writers. After 4 months in Israel, his wife fell ill and died. These were not easy conditions to live. Malaria was very common. In the old Yishuv, you also had the plague. It was a very difficult time. Brenner was a pessimist, but Gordon was full of faith and hope. Gordon really believed in Zionism, really believed in the idea of coming back to the land, that it's creating this new relationship between the people and the land, like the soul entering the body all over again. He almost had a mystical concept of this. In 1911, Asher Ginsburg, known as Achad Ha'am, is another ideologue, secular Zionism, and also came from a religious background. I'm telling all of them, arrives in the town of Ein Ganim. He wrote in an article that, in his opinion, there is no way to establish a class of Jewish workers in Israel. It says Jews are not menial laborers. It'll never happen. We're doctors, we're lawyers, we're writers. That's what we do. This led to a heated debate. Gordon again tried to mediate, but without success, because the whole point of the kibbutz movement is to create a class of laborers of the land who would work the land. Achad Ha'am didn't think it was possible. 1912, Gordon's daughter went to work in the Galilee, and Gordon joined her and started working in a tower. But after the inspector insulted one of the workers, Gordon resigned. He was very much a man of of principles. After that, he worked in Tel Adashim, another settlement, as a guard, but he refused to carry a weapon. So therefore, he walked around with a whistle. If he saw something that he thought was suspicious, he would blow on the whistle, and one of the guards who actually had a weapon would come check. In 1914, his son is taken to war. What happened here? No. Sorry. Okay, I see. Okay, 1940. Oh, one second. This happens because of the Hebrew and the English and a little bit. Son wants to go to Israel, but the war prevents him. The First World War. In 1919, his son dies of typhus. Gordon dies in Degania, in kibbutz Degania, at the age of 66. So basically, he spent 18 years in Israel. Gordon believed that the problem of the people of Israel is their disconnection from nature, and that the return to Zion is the return to nature. The return to nature is done through the return to the nation with its geographical roots. As I said, he almost saw it as a mystical concept. He was a socialist, but opposed Marx's idea of class struggle. He wrote, "Improving life is done by elevating man, and the improvement of society is done by raising the individual. The raising of the individual is done through the raising of society." For him, the Zionist movement's goal is moral and spiritual, not necessarily through the observance of mitzvot, even though Gordon was not opposed to the observance of mitzvot, and he actually kept them most of his life. But Gordon thought that manual labor, physical labor, was a way to return to nature. He saw this almost as a holy activity. Okay, this was an example, one of the ideologues of early secular Zionism, what we call labor Zionism. All these people came from religious homes. David Ben-Gurion, Ber Baruchov, Agnon, Bialik, everyone, almost without exception. In fact, and also, as I said, because the Western European Jews, who were the ones who were really secularists, they were not interested in Zionism. There were only two exceptions. One was Theodor Herzl, and the other one was Max Nordau. You really don't have Western European Jews who were interested in Zionism. Moses Hess was also an exception. But the Russian Jews, the Polish Jews, the Romanian Jews, these were the ones who were interested in Zionism. They saw this as a way of rebuilding their lives and giving themselves emancipation through nationalism. I want to read you one last thing. This will be an introduction to Dr. Midan's lecture next week when she talks about religious Zionism. See if I can find it quickly. Okay. As I said, from 1905 till 1930, you have idealistic Zionism, which is people who are leaving their homes for whatever reason and coming to a land which is very difficult to live in. If you want to live in the cities, you can get along. If you go to live in Jerusalem, go live in Sfat, you go live in Tiberias, Hebron, you have a chance. Jaffa. But if you want to start an agricultural settlement, like all these people are actually trying to do, that's really difficult. If You want to start creating a city like Tel Aviv in 1905 or Netanya in 1909? That's difficult. They're just sand dunes. That's a lot of work. And but these were idealists who wanted to do this, who saw this as a dream come true. And by the way, a lot of them had difficulties. Many died from malaria. There were swamps in the Chula Valley. It took years to dry out the swamps, which were creating malaria in the north, in the Galilee. And the truth is, many of these people made Aliyah, gave up, and went back to their countries of origin because it was just too difficult. It is better to have loved and lost than not to have loved at all, they say in English. So you can't blame people. It was very, very difficult. One of the unique phenomena, as I said before, about these early pioneers was this idea that they had rebelled against their traditionalist families and saw Zionism as a new interpretation of Jewish identity. So if this course is about identities, this is really a question of identity. They're developing an Israeli identity before Israel as a country. The new Jewish identity, because they don't necessarily call it Israeli, it's a Jewish Israeli identity, is based on agriculture, on communal living, on democratic decisions in communal living, on very strong socialism as an idea, which of course makes sense because they all came from Russia and Poland, where socialism was the belief of the day, especially under Lenin. All the Jews under Lenin believed in socialism. It took them years even to understand that Stalin had changed everything. Even the Jews living in Israel, it took them years to understand that Stalin had changed everything. It's not by mistake that Trotsky was the right-hand man of Lenin, because he was also a believing communist. But this was an interesting mindset. There's a rabbi who makes Aliyah from Lithuania exactly during this time, who was determined to be the rabbi of these secular pioneers. His name is Abraham Isaac Cook. You can see here in Wikipedia. He's invited to be the rabbi of Jaffa. It's called Jaffa and the Settlements, which means the rabbi of these secular Zionists. Not that they invited him, but he was invited by the people of Jaffa to do so. He's born in 1865 in Latvia. At the time, it was Lithuania. He was the first chief rabbi of British Mandatory Palestine, but he's already the rabbi in Jaffa in 1904. So he basically comes to Israel at the same time of the second Aliyah. But he is very, very different than them, but he learns to love them. 1904, Rabbi Cook was invited to be the rabbi in Jaffa, in Ottoman Palestine, being under the Ottoman rule. He arrives there in 1905. During this year, he wrote many books. In 1911, he had a correspondence with the Jews of Yemen, etc. Now, during the First World War, he got stuck in Germany, where he had gone there on a visit. He makes his way to London and to Switzerland. In London, he takes on a position until the war is over, comes back to Israel in 1919. 1919, he becomes the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Jerusalem under the British, and then the first Ashkenazic rabbi of Palestine of the British Mandate in 1921 until his death in 1935. Even though many of the new settlers were hostile to religion, because they had rebelled against it. Rabbi Kook defended their behavior. And he wrote a lot of things saying you have to understand these people. They might have rebelled against tradition, but they are lovers of their people. And you have to see them as such. Said they're complicated, but they're not bad. So, says, I'm trying to put it in the way he understood the situation. He also gives a talk at the inauguration of the Hebrew University in 1921. See what else they have here. Now I'll give you something for mine. Okay, let's put this aside for the moment. Okay. I'm going to read to you something from Rabbi Kook. Rabbi Kook believed that the return to the land of Israel is a sign of the redemption, the messianic era of biblical dimensions. And he writes in a book called Arpalei Tohar, the first generation of the footsteps of the Messiah. The footsteps of Messiah is a term used in the Mishnah, in the oral tradition. What does it mean, the footsteps of the Messiah? Which means you can't see the Messiah, but you can see his footsteps. In other words, we're getting close. In that first generation, called the generation, the footsteps of the Messiah, at the beginning of the revealed end, which is the settlement of the land of Israel, meaning that's a sign that you're getting close when you see the land of Israel being settled. This prepares the material element of the congregation of Israel. And spirituality will only serve to preserve the inner life. Rav Kook claims that this was known in advance, that there would be a movement at the beginning, right on the eve of the period of redemption, where you would have people who are interested in building up the physical and material aspects of the nation. And he gives an example. Just as a child has to learn how to eat and crawl and walk before they can talk and think, so too the nation has to build itself up physically before it builds itself up ideally, morally, and spiritually. Those things take time. So first, it has to build it up physically before it gains an actual identity. But when the physical power of the nation is strong, then we get to a point of homeostasis. The country becomes strong enough to stand on its own two legs. And all of the spiritual virtues will be revealed. The Torah with all its light will return to be the light of the world. And a crown of glory in the hand of God, a crown of royalty in the palm of the God of Israel. These are all verses from Isaiah. So according to Rav Kook, he says this is just the way it's going to happen. When a fruit grows on a tree, first the peel of the fruit develops, and then only after the inside of the fruit. Now we all know why, because if there's no peel, there's nothing to prevent the insects and the parasites from eating the fruit. But Rav Kook sees this as a stage theory. First the physical, then the identity, the morality, the spirituality. That's how a human being also grows. That's the way the Jews return to the land. They have these people who are going to spend all their time trying to establish the country and settlements. And only later on will the identity start to grow and solidify. Kook was aware that there was an old yeshuv which was very traditionalist, but he was referring specifically to these new pioneers who he felt were the ones which were going to be the sign of the future, of how the country, in other words, they were going to model the country. The people of the old yeshuv would still be there, but these ones who are so active would actually model the country. And that's why he spent all his time trying to gain inroads with them. There's a story in 1919, when Rabbi Kook came back to Israel after the war. He got together with Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld, who is a very ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Mea Sharim in Jerusalem. And he convinced them, let's go visit these pioneers in the kibbutzim in the north. Sonnenfeld said, okay. He figured, okay, I'll give them speeches about Torah. So they went to different places. They went to Zichron Yaakov. They went to Rosh Pina. They went to some kibbutzim. At one point, they come to a kibbutz right next to kibbutz Degania, which was actually new immigrants had come to that kibbutz. Again, a very secular kibbutz. And they walk in and they greet everybody in the dining hall, because that's where you meet people. And just as Rabbi Kook and Rabbi Sonnenfeld walk into the dining hall, somebody walks right over to him and says, "You rabbis, why did you come here? You have nothing to teach us here." Rabbi Kook, without even batting an eyelid, he says, "We didn't come here to teach you. We came here to learn from you." That's what happened. So they say that when in that specific kibbutz, they stayed there on Shabbat, and most of the time, the people stayed away. They say that when Shabbat was over, a lot of these kibbutzim, which were very socialist, they would have dancing and music in like one place. They had like a hall where it all would take place, because these are very small settlements. So he saw the workers dancing around. So Rabbi Kook had an idea. He wanted to show that he's like them. He walked out, asked one of the workers if he could have a worker's uniform from the kibbutz. He took off his kaftan, put on the worker's uniform, ran in again, started dancing with some of the guys from the kibbutz. Everybody was laughing that the rabbi was dressed as a worker in the kibbutz, but it helped to break down barriers. I'll tell you one last story. There's a story told by, saw this on a video, Rabbi Dov Joseph Soloveitchik, who was a rabbi born in Lithuania, studied in Germany, and between the wars came to the United States, or maybe even after the war. And he was a famous rabbi who lived in Boston. He tells a story that he was in Israel after the Second World War, around 1950. And he went to meet a friend of his at one of the kibbutzim in that area near Tiberias. And so they met in the dining room, and the man said, "Can I bring you something?" He says, I'll have an apple, that's it. Okay, brings him an apple. So they have a talk, and the man said, "Why didn't you want to eat anything?" The Rabbi Soloveitchik said, "Well, I figured this kibbutz is not religious. You probably don't have any kosher food." And says, "No, we have a kosher kitchen." He says, "What do you mean? How come you have a kosher kitchen?" He says, "Oh, I'll tell you what the story was." He says it was it happened about 20 years ago, around 1930. Rabbi Kook came to visit the kibbutz. And nobody in the kibbutz understood what he was doing there. He came for the week, for Shabbat. He came with a bottle of wine and 3 challahs, which are the 3 breads that we use on the Sabbath. In Hebrew, we call them challah. It's a braided bread that we use on the Sabbath. So he came with his little packages, and they found him a place to sleep. So Friday night, there was no service because there was no synagogue. Okay, he prayed by himself. Then he walked into the dining room, and he took a seat at one of the tables. Nobody paid attention to him. Some people were turning on and off the lights just to make a statement. Nothing. They just totally disregarded. He sat down, said the blessing over the wine and over the bread, and that was his meal. Went to sleep. Next morning, there was no service. Again, he came to the dining room, said the blessing over the wine, over the bread, whatever. Anyhow, that night, Shabbat was over, and they invited him to come to the town meeting, because every weekend these kibbutzim would have meetings of everybody in the kibbutz, how many they were, 100, 200. So he comes to the meeting, he listens a bit. And then again, when the meeting's over, they have the dancing, which is normally what they would do in these kibbutzim in the early years. So Rabbi Kook joins the dancing, and everybody's excited to see him join. And then finally, when the music stops, Rabbi Kook says, and now that we dance together, maybe next time I come, we'll even be able to eat together. So he said next week they had a meeting of the kibbutz, and they said that's a good idea. They decided to establish a kosher kitchen in case Rabbi Kook would come back and to visit them again. So this story was told in 1950, 20 years later, by one of the members of that kibbutz, Rabbi Soloveitchik. This is there are a lot of stories about Rabbi Kook and his belief that this was part of the way God works through messengers. And you never know who God's messenger is. They might not look like the chief rabbi, but it doesn't mean they're not a messenger. So there's a story, the rabbi of the Hasidic movement of Gur. Gur is from a city in Poland called Góra Kawaria. And in 1921, he came to Jerusalem and he met with Rabbi Kook. Outside of Israel, there were a lot of condemnations of Rabbi Kook that he was too close to all these seculars. They thought he was a little bit crazy. So the rabbi of Gur met with Rabbi Kook, and they got into a chariot to go to the old city. As they were going through the new city, the rabbi of Gur said, "This is so terrible. Jerusalem was a city of all holy people, and now you see these secularists who are living in the new part of Jerusalem." Rabbi Kook didn't say anything. Just before they got to Jaffa Gate, they passed what was called the Sultan's Pool, which is called the Hinnom Valley, as it's mentioned in the book of Joshua and in the book of Jeremiah. In the Hinnom Valley, by the way, according to the book of Jeremiah, that's where you had the worship of the Molech, pagan worship where children were passed in the fire or over the fire, a god called Molech. So as they're coming towards Jaffa Gate, they passed by the Sultan's Pool, which was the Hinnom Valley. Rabbi Kook turns to the rabbi of Gur and says, our ancient ancestors in the time of the Bible used to worship idolatry in this valley. Thank God they don't do that anymore. That's it. In other words, you have to see the good and not always look for the bad. The rabbi of Gur, I guess, was not convinced. In his letters, there's a book published of his letters. In a letter he wrote back to his disciples in 1921, he writes, "I met with Rabbi Kook. I tried to understand what he's doing, and it seems to me that his love of the Jewish people made him go overboard." So, that's the reason why he's doing what he's doing. They couldn't understand why somebody who wanted to become so close to these secularists. Very, very interesting. The story of Rabbi Kook. Tell you one other thing about Rabbi Kook. I'm going to read to you in Hebrew. This is from one of his works. I'll just say it, I won't read it. Rabbi Kook, in one of his diaries, all his writings were like philosophical, spiritual diaries, even mystical diaries. He doesn't actually write books. Has an idea, he writes it down, that's it. Next day has an idea, writes it down. That's all his works are like that. They're just all these notebooks with his ideas. In one of the published works, which was another notebook of his ideas, so he says, sometimes God has to work through funny ways, because there are certain things that would never happen if you had to depend on the religious Jews. So it says, for instance, the land of Israel. Which rabbi would have gotten up and declared that we need an army to fight a war? Which rabbi would have got up to say we need a police force? Which one would have gone out to start, I don't know, politicking? It says sometimes it's the ones who are more distant from the tradition, who can do things that the ones who are inside the tradition don't have a clue of how to do. It says God works in strange ways, but this is the way you have to understand. This is all from above. I'm paraphrasing, but that's really what the gist of what he says in our Play Torah. And he really believed that it was really important to bring these people as close as possible, incorporating their new identity with their understanding them, seeing themselves as proud Jews. Okay, so today I basically talked about what I call early Zionism, from Russian Zionism and Romanian Zionism under the Hibat movement, herzlian Zionism, which is the beginning of secular Zionism, to the first Aliyah, which is still a traditionalist Aliyah from the Hibat movement, to the second Aliyah of 1905, which is the first what we call secular Zionist Aliyah. There are a few things interesting about this Aliyah. Number one, it's secular, but almost all of its members were people who had come from religious homes because they came from Eastern Europe and Russia and Poland, where everybody was religious anyhow, because the emancipation had not really set foot in those places. And also, because they came from Russia, socialism was something they believed in and wanted to establish it in the land of Israel. They wanted to create forms of democratic socialist communes. And their settlements were all cooperative, whether they were kibbutz or yeshuvim, they were all cooperative in those early years of working together, which was actually smart at that time because they were able to survive that way. As individuals, it would have been very, very difficult. The kibbutz movement in modern Israel today makes up maybe 3% of the population, but its historical impact was very great. To this day, kibbutz movement had many members of the Knesset, for instance, even though it was only 3% of the population since the establishment of the state. But as an ideology, it had a very strong nationalist ideology. Okay, I don't want to say more than that because I want to stop at this point, 1930. Because 1930 is before what we call the next Aliyah, the next wave of Aliyah. Our Jews are running away from Nazi Germany to come to the land of Israel. Officially 1933, but in the early 30s already, Jews are starting to feel the rumbles of the earthquake, which is about to happen in Germany. Rabbi Kook, who dies in 1935, he already warns the Jews of Germany that this Hitler is not going to be just a regular leader. He dies in 1935. And there are others who saw that too, specifically Chaim Arlozorov, who maybe I will mention too. But what I'd like to do is, when I talk about I want to talk briefly about the Aliyah, the establishment of the country, and then I want to talk about the Aliyah of the Shoah survivors, who had a major impact on the early years of the country, and the Aliyah of the Jews from the Arab countries, who had a major impact on the identity of Israel. So that will be in my next meeting. My next meeting, therefore, will not be next Thursday. On Friday, Dr. Maidan will speak. She'll be in Bucharest. And then I will speak maybe 2 weeks after that, because I think she's going to give a talk also the Thursday after that. I'll have to find out. Okay. Thank you, everyone.